I'm thrilled to welcome you all back to our familiar Nighttime Stories Hour. Let's reconnect with audio nighttime stories. Today's tale is titled The Forest Ghost, Part 2. For those tuning in for the first time, please support the channel by hitting the subscribe button, and don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a new story. And if you enjoy today's tale, please give it a like. The more likes a story gets, the more YouTube recommends it to others. Thank you so much. Now, without keeping you waiting any longer, let's dive right into the story. When Tu Yen woke up, she realized she had been changed into clean clothes and carefully bandaged. She looked around and found herself in a tidy room. Though the decor was simple, it exuded elegance. A gentle breeze swept through, making the thin curtains sway, as the warm sunlight blended with the crisp morning air, creating a strangely serene and soothing atmosphere. For a moment, her heart softened, as if all her worries and pain had dissolved in this fleeting peace. A maid stepped into the room carrying a glass of cool water, followed by a beautiful young woman in a loose-fitting traditional outfit made from luxurious fabric. The woman, cradling her large belly, walked slowly and cautiously, as she was already 8 months pregnant. Seeing Tu Yen awake, she turned to the maid, instructing her to inform someone that Tu Yen had regained consciousness. Then, she sat gently by Tu Yen's side, smiling as she handed her the glass of water. "How are you feeling? My name is Truck. What's your name? Were you attacked? You're covered in injuries." Tu Yen accepted the glass with both hands and replied, "Thank you for saving me, sister. My name is Tu Yen. I was kidnapped by a deranged man." She briefly recounted the horrifying events of her abduction and the torment she endured. Truck listened, her eyes widening in shock and disbelief. She couldn't fathom how someone could love so obsessively to the point of madness. "Poor girl, but I wasn't the one who saved you. It was my husband's friend. His name is Bao. He brought you back, but he didn't know what to do next, so he asked us to come help." Just as she finished speaking, 2 men entered the room. One of them rushed to Truck, carrying a bag of pastries, his face beaming with excitement. "Wife, I bought the pastries you were craving." The other man glanced over and said, "Nam, can you tone it down? Spare a thought for Bao here. I'm still single, and you're rubbing it in my face." Tu Yen slowly lifted her eyes to look at Bao. He was tall, with delicate features and pale skin, the kind of complexion that made her think of a sheltered rich boy. She had encountered plenty of men like him, but she masked her thoughts with a sweet smile. Her fragile appearance on the sickbed made it almost impossible for anyone not to feel sympathetic. "Thank you, Bao, for saving me," she said softly. The room fell into an awkward silence. Bao couldn't take his eyes off Tu Yen, while Nam and Truck stared at him. The tension stretched until Tu Yen's smile nearly froze on her face. Finally, Nam burst out laughing, shattering the heavy atmosphere. "Let's go home, honey. I've seen this scene before," he teased, grabbing Truck's hand and dragging her away, ignoring Bao's attempts to stop them. On the ride home, Truck couldn't contain her curiosity. "Why did we leave so suddenly?" she asked. Nam chuckled and playfully pinched her cheek. "The way Bao looks at Tu Yen is exactly how I looked at you when we met in the plum orchard. Except, of course, I was way more charming." Truck rolled her eyes, accustomed to her husband's endless self-praise. Ever since she became pregnant, he made her stare at him every day, claiming that doing so would pass his legendary good looks onto their child. After bidding the couple farewell, Bao returned to the room. Despite his reputation as a wealthy heir, he wasn't a playboy. In fact, he devoted most of his time to studying. He harbored a simple dream: to become a teacher and one day return to his hometown to open small classes for the villagers. Because of this, even though he lived in Saigon, he had no idea who Tu Yen was, despite her notorious fame. He took a deep breath and stepped back into the room, feeling oddly nervous. Despite being a top student known for his eloquence, Bao now found himself awkwardly grabbing the leftover pastries Nam had forgotten and offering them to Tu Yen. Do you want some pastries?" he stammered. Tu Yen's eyes twinkled with amusement. "No, thank you. I'm not hungry." She had encountered many wealthy young men before, but most of them tried to show off their intelligence in front of her. Bao, on the other hand, wore his cluelessness right on his face. It was oddly refreshing. Not wanting to beat around the bush, she decided to get straight to the point. "Thank you for saving me, but could you help me with one more thing?" "Of course, whatever you need," Bao blurted out without hesitation. He had already made up his mind. Even if Tu Yen asked him to fetch a star from the sky, he'd be up on the roof that night figuring out how to do it. "I was kidnapped on my way to Vin Long. Could you arrange for someone to take me there?" "Vin Long? Oh, I know that place. I can take you myself tomorrow." "Is that where your home is? Or do you have relatives there? Or were you sold to someone as a fourth wife or something?" Tu Yen shook her head and, after a brief hesitation, decided to tell the truth. "I need to go to the mansion of Ba Kai, the biggest landowner in the region. All my belongings were sent there, including a keepsake from my mother. I can't afford to lose it. Please help me." The moment she finished speaking, Bao's bright, carefree smile faded. His gaze softened, and a subtle, unreadable curve remained on his lips. He lowered his head slightly and spoke in a voice so gentle it startled Tu Yen, who was used to facing life's harshest realities. "I guess I should start calling you Mother too now." From that moment until the next morning, even when they were already on the car heading back to Vin Long, Tu Yen never saw that bright smile on Bao's face again. Now he spoke more fluently than before, but there was a distant coldness in his voice. Strangely, that coldness made Tu Yen feel an inexplicable discomfort. She quietly looked outside, watching the scenery slowly pass through the car window. At first, it was the bustling city streets, the calls of street vendors, the crowded roads. Gradually, endless golden rice fields, lush green trees, and winding paths appeared, then slowly faded out of sight. In the silent space, only the sound of the car engine remained. Tu Yen lowered her head, lost in her thoughts about her life, a bitter joke. She wondered what karmic sins she had committed in her past life to endure such relentless suffering in this one. When she was a child, her parents died right before her eyes. Not long after, she was sold to a brothel, living in daily humiliation. And now, just as she escaped that place, she was sold again to another unfamiliar and uncertain destination. Her life seemed like an endless journey from one hell to another, without a single moment of peace. "Why are you so sad, Matu?" Bao's voice broke the silence. Tu Yen glanced at him, anger rising within her. She wanted to hit his face for calling her Ma Tuesday, but she swallowed her rage. After all, the way he addressed her wasn't wrong. She could only glare at him with furious eyes. Seeing her upset, Bao grew restless. As they neared their destination, Tu Yen kept gazing at the endless golden fields. So Bao told the driver to stop the car. "Let's get out and walk for a bit. You've probably never seen a ripe rice field. Have you?" Tu Yen nodded honestly, as it was true. She stepped out, taking a deep breath, savoring the fresh, cool air. Her eyes stretched out across the vast golden fields. Though the sun was shining, its light was gentle, not harsh. The soft breeze swayed the heavy rice stalks, making them bow and sway as if greeting the blue sky. For Tu Yen, who loved simplicity and tranquility, the scenery made her smile genuinely from her heart. Bao stood beside her, captivated by her sincere smile. Just then, a farmhand came running, waving his hands frantically. Thinking the man recognized him, Bao smiled and waved back. But the man didn't stop. He kept shouting and running wildly. Bao's smile froze when he finally understood the words the man was shouting. "The buffalo!" A massive buffalo was charging straight at them. Bao's face went pale, and he immediately grabbed Tu Yen's hand, pulling her to run. Tu Yen panicked, kicking off her sandals and sprinting while screaming. "Why is it chasing us?" she cried. "You wore red to the field. Of course, the buffalo's chasing you. Run faster," Bao shouted back. Several farmhands rushed over, grabbing the rope around the buffalo's neck to stop it. Tu Yen, who had grown up walking delicately and gracefully, quickly exhausted herself from running. The ground was slippery after the rain, and Bao's forceful pull made her trip and fall into a muddy ditch. The buffalo stopped, losing sight of the red color. Bao, horrified, jumped into the ditch to help her up. Tu Yen flailed, using her hands and feet to cling to the ditch's edge. Her hair and clothes caked in mud. She looked like a little swamp creature, making Bao burst into uncontrollable laughter. Embarrassed and furious, Tu Yen grabbed a handful of mud and threw it straight at Bao's face, blinding him momentarily. He could only bend down and wash his face in the ditch water while Tu Yen laughed triumphantly. The driver ran over, helping Bao climb back onto the road. Tu Yen stormed off, but after only a few steps, Bao called out, "Tu Yen, there's a leech on your leg." She looked down and saw a fat leech clinging to her skin. She screamed, shaking her leg to fling it off, but it wouldn't budge. "Take it off! Hurry! Get it off me!" she shrieked. Bao calmly approached, knelt down, and grabbed her foot. He raised an eyebrow, smirking. "But it's a bit awkward, you know? You have to agree, or I'll leave it there as a New Year's snack. Just take it off."
Tu Yen yelled.
Chuckling, Bao spit a bit of saliva on the leech. Miraculously, it released its grip and dropped off. Afterward, Bao asked for 2 banana leaves to place on the car seat so they wouldn't dirty the upholstery. He scratched his head, glancing at Tu Yen. "I know you're mad again, but with this attitude, maybe you'll never want to talk to me again," he sighed. The laughter in his eyes faded as the car pulled up to the grand gate of his family estate. It was a magnificent mansion, built entirely of rare wood, expansive and luxurious. As soon as the car stopped, 5 or 6 servants rushed out to greet them. They gasped at Bao's mud-covered appearance, but his next words shocked them even more. "Prepare clothes and a hot bath for Tu Yen. She's been cold for a while now." The servants exchanged glances, their eyes gleaming with curiosity. "Looks like Master Bao finally brought home a wife," one whispered. In truth, Tu Yen didn't want to get out of the car. She knew that the moment she stepped down, her life would once again spiral into endless suffering. She sighed, then decided to step out. If it's fate, there's no escaping it. Better to face it head-on, she thought. Bao bathed and changed much faster than Tu Yen. He told Mio, a servant, to inform Aunt Siusi to bring Tu Yen to the main hall once she was ready. And so, the next chapter of their intertwined lives began. As soon as he finished his words, he walked forward. Before stepping into the main room, he saw his father leisurely sipping tea, looking relaxed. Beside him was the first wife, graceful and composed. The maid and Lu stood quietly behind, holding a tea tray and a fan. In another corner, the third wife sat attentively watching her little daughter take her first steps, her eyes filled with love. However, Bao's gaze was quickly drawn to a strange young woman sitting nearby. She didn't seem to be a family member, nor did she look like a servant. Bao folded his arms and politely greeted, "Father, Mother, I'm back." Understanding the hesitation in Bao's voice, the first wife spoke calmly. "This is Tan Lu, your father's 4th wife, whom he just married from Saigon. She arrived here yesterday. Her father is a teacher. Who knows, maybe you were once his student." Lu was surprised to see Bao. He was the one who had helped her that day in town. But at this moment, Bao had no interest in figuring out who she was. He simply looked at Tan Lu with deep confusion. He thought to himself, "This person is my 4th mother? How did Tai Yen end up marrying my father?" Just as Bao was drowning in his thoughts, Chi Siusi brought Tai Yen over. As soon as she arrived, she heard the introduction but remained calm, standing beside Bao, waiting for him to introduce her. However, he remained stunned, staring at Lu. The third wife sneered, "Bao, why are you staring at your 4th mother like that? She may look around your age, but you still have to call her mother." Mr. Ba Kai cleared his throat, as if to remind his son, snapping Bao back to reality. Realizing his mistake, he quickly adjusted his attitude and turned to Tai Yen. "Oh, right, let me introduce everyone. This is Tai Yen, my girlfriend from Saigon." Tai Yen smiled at Lu as she spoke. The room fell silent for a moment. Liu's eyes flickered with surprise and discomfort, but she quickly regained her composure, keeping her smile as if the statement didn't bother her. Mr. Ba Kai and the first wife scrutinized Tai Yen carefully. Tai Yen suspected that something had happened at the brothel after she left, which had forced Liu into this situation. But that was perfect. All she needed now was to retrieve the ring containing her mother's soul, and she would be free. Thinking of that lifted a weight off her chest, making her smile brightly. Seeing her smile, Bao unconsciously smiled as well, his face flushing red. The third wife laughed mockingly. Well, isn't that just like the son of a famous singer? Skin so fair it turns pink. If only my daughter were half as fair as you. Honestly, Bao looks so much like his mother. But before she could finish, Mr. Ba Kai slammed the table, his face burning with anger. The first wife quickly tried to mediate. Come on, dear, she's just back home. This is her first visit, you'll scare her. And you, little sister, how can you speak so rudely about your second sister? You're a mother now. You must be careful with your words. Then she turned to Tai Yen and asked, How long have you two been together? Tai Yen quietly exhaled, reminding herself that this was just a short play. Once she retrieved the ring, she would leave, so there was no need to win the family's favor. She decided to tell the truth. We've been together for over a year, ma'am. What do your parents do? The first wife asked. Tai Yen, in a calm voice, replied, My parents have passed away. It's just me now. But I plan to open a fabric shop in Saigon. The room froze again. The first wife raised an eyebrow, her displeasure evident. She glanced at Mr. Ba Kai as if seeking agreement. But before he could respond, a woman's loud cries echoed from outside. She rushed in, arms wide, and hugged Bao tightly. My son is home. My son is home. Bao turned and smiled warmly, his eyes filled with tenderness. The woman wore a white silk blouse with exquisitely sewn seams, her hair neatly combed but adorned with a bright red hibiscus flower. In her hands was a bizarre fabric doll. Despite her age, her facial features were strikingly sharp, and indeed, Bao bore a strong resemblance to her. Yet her behavior was wild, her voice loud enough to feel like she was shouting at everyone. Bao wasn't embarrassed or flustered by his mother's eccentricity. Instead, he gently embraced her, patting her back to soothe her. He smiled calmly and introduced her to Tai Yen. This is my mother. Tai Yen smiled kindly and bowed. Hello, Auntie. I'm Tai Yen, Bao's friend. The woman clung to her son, her eyes wary and fearful as she whispered, Bao, I'm scared. Mr. Ba Kai's roar from inside the house shook everyone. Servant, how did you let her run wild like that? What if she falls? A servant came running in, panting and out of breath. Madam ran so fast, I couldn't catch up. Liu glanced at Mr. Ba Kai, puzzled. This was the most bewildering part of the household. After bribing the maid Cuc, Liu learned that the first wife was the niece of a high-ranking court official, married into the family at 16. A few years later, Bao was born. It wasn't until over a decade later, after both of Mr. Ba's parents had passed away, that he married the second wife. Mrs. Hai was once a famous opera singer in Vin Long. When she returned home, she was already pregnant with Mr. Bao. 2 years later, she gave birth to Mr. Tam, but unfortunately, he passed away when he was only 3 months old. The death of her youngest child devastated Mrs. Hai, especially since Mr. Ba Kai brought Mrs. Ba into the house not long after. From then on, Mrs. Hai lost her sanity, carrying around a handmade doll and treating it as if it were little Tam. Mrs. Ba became pregnant several times, but due to her frail health or some misfortune, she kept miscarrying. It was only recently that she managed to give birth to An. Meanwhile, Mrs. Hai, in her madness, had nearly died several times. The most recent incident was just a month before Liu came to the house. Rumor had it that Mrs. Hai had gone out to play with the Lai dog and was bitten by a snake. Fortunately, a healer specializing in venomous snake bites lived nearby. Otherwise, she would have died. As for the children in the house, Mr. Sun, the eldest son, was born to Mrs. Ca. He had been married to Mrs. Liu for over 5 years, but they still had no children. Most of the family business was entrusted to Mr. Sun by Mr. Ba. Yet ironically, Mr. Ba seemed to love Mr. Bao more, even though Bao remained in Saigon and refused to help with the family affairs. What puzzled Lu even more was why Mrs. Hai, despite her insanity, was never locked up or treated poorly. On the contrary, she was cared for and treated just like the other wives. CUC, the nosy maid, speculated that it was all because Mr. Ba loved Mr. Bao so much. One afternoon, when the house was quiet, Lu approached Tu Yen's room and signaled her to come to the garden to talk. Tu Yen, unfazed, calmly followed. Once they reached a secluded spot, Lu grabbed Tu Yen's hand and whispered hoarsely, "We've both been tricked by Mong Deep, from the rumors about you practicing witchcraft to the scheme of selling me off through Mrs. Mai Lu. It was all her doing. She even colluded with the judge to acquire the brothel. She's not as innocent as we thought. We were both deceived." Tu Yen gently withdrew her hand, her face indifferent as if Liu's shocking revelations meant nothing to her. She didn't care about Liu's crocodile tears. She replied flatly, "How do you expect to survive in this deceitful world without being cunning? If she could plot like that, good for her. I don't care who betrayed whom anymore. I just want you to return the ring I kept in the brown wooden box. Give it back, and I'll leave right away." Lu flinched, remembering the pile of luggage that had arrived before Tu Yen. Thankfully, Mrs. Mai Lu had already written a letter to marry Lu off to Mr. Ba Kai. All Lu had to do was deliver the letter, and she was instantly accepted as the fourth wife. That was how she escaped her fate. Tu Yen was supposed to take her place, but Lu showed up first and took advantage of the situation when Tu Yen was in a coma. Feigning innocence, Lu shook her head. "Honestly, I haven't touched your things, so I don't know where the box is. If you let me, I'll look for it later." But Tu Yen furrowed her brows and snapped, "If you don't return it within 3 days, don't blame me." She turned and walked away, her cold demeanor leaving Lu standing frozen with hatred burning in her eyes. While glaring after Tu Yen, Lu suddenly heard rustling from a banana grove nearby. Squinting in suspicion, she cautiously approached, only to find Mrs. Hai crouching and hiding. The older woman's face was tense as if she were escaping someone. Before Lu could speak, Mrs. Hai quickly gestured for silence and whispered, "Don't make a sound. I'm hiding from Lai. She keeps forcing me to take medicine. But I'm as strong as an ox. Why do I need medicine? The crazy ones are those who keep shoving pills down my throat." Lu eyed Mrs. Hai suspiciously but smirked as a cunning idea formed in her mind. "If you can tell me what I was talking about with Tu Yen, I'll buy you some pigskin cake. Deal?" Mrs. Hai's eyes sparkled at the mention of cake, but she still whispered, "You two were planning to go bathe in the river, right? I heard it clearly. You promised, so don't forget to buy me the cake." Satisfied, Lu turned back toward her room, but as she neared, she heard furious yelling from Mr. Sun's room. Curious, she hid in a corner to eavesdrop. The door suddenly slammed open, and Mr. Sun stormed out, his face livid. He jabbed a finger back inside and shouted, "You're as stiff as a dry log. It's unbearable. I'm telling Mother to find me another wife. At this rate, who knows when I'll have a child." He left, leaving only Mrs. Li's heartbroken sobs echoing from inside the room. Tu Yen returned to her room, feeling weak and feverish. Sweat drenched her body, and she suspected she had caught a cold. But she didn't want to bother anyone, especially Mr. Bao, whom she had already burdened enough. She collapsed onto the bed, hoping a good sleep would restore her strength. In her feverish daze, a knock echoed through her room. Struggling to her feet, she opened the door to find Mrs. Hai standing there, holding a wooden box, her eyes sharp and serious. "Take this and leave," Mrs. Hai said. "Bao is my son. I won't let anyone near him." Tu Yen leaned against the doorframe to steady herself. She glanced at the box and let out a bitter laugh. How many times in her life had people shoved money or objects at her just to make her disappear? Her voice trembled with exhaustion. "No need. Once I retrieve my mother's keepsake, I'll leave on my own." But Mrs. Hai wouldn't let her refuse. She shoved the box into Tu Yen's hands so hastily that the box loosened and fell to the ground. Tu Yen looked down, and her face immediately turned pale. Inside the box was a writhing mass of fat, bright green caterpillars, their shiny bodies squirming and twisting grotesquely. She screamed in terror, her entire body breaking out in goosebumps. She frantically threw the box away and tried to run into her room to shut the door, but her weak legs gave out. After only a few stumbling steps, she tripped and fell, her head hitting the ground with a loud, dry thud. Everything went dark. When Tu Yen slowly regained consciousness, she heard Mrs. Hai's trembling voice murmuring, "I'm sorry. Don't be mad at me. I'm so sorry." Before she could respond, Bao was already pressing a warm towel to her forehead, his words spilling out uncontrollably. "You're awake? How are you feeling? Are you hurt? Do you feel pain anywhere? Are you hungry?" She barely had the strength to answer, but he continued, "Oh, never mind. Just drink some water first. Sister Susie, please bring me a glass of water." Tu Yen struggled to sit up and took a small sip, then whispered hoarsely, "It's not your fault, Auntie. I've been unwell for days, and I fell because I was too weak to walk properly." No, it wasn't me. Don't be mad at me, okay?" Mrs. Hai kept repeating, her voice cracking. At that moment, a servant knocked on the door and respectfully announced, "Sir, ma'am, dinner is ready." Bao glanced at Tu Yen, his voice gentle. "Try to eat a little, okay? You'll get better faster. After dinner, I'll ask Sister Cuc to prepare a herbal bath for you. You'll feel much better after that." Tu Yen looked at him and smiled faintly, nodding. During dinner, Lu discreetly observed Sun's reaction to Tu Yen. As she expected, Sun's eyes lit up like a cat spotting a mouse. He had been out collecting rice in the fields that morning, and when he returned, his wife told him that Bao had brought a guest home. He never imagined the guest would be such a beauty. After stealing glances at Tu Yen, Sun turned to look at his wife, Mo Lu, her dark, sun-kissed skin and stocky frame, a sharp contrast to Tu Yen's frail elegance. Sun could only sigh in frustration. His mother had forced him to marry Mo Lu because her family was wealthy and well-connected. She believed their influence would help him in business, but all Sun felt now was exhaustion from enduring his unhappy marriage. He glanced at Tu Yen again and swallowed involuntarily, the small gulp echoing in his throat. The woman in front of him, even in her sickly state, exuded a delicate, heartbreaking vulnerability that made people want to protect her. Every inch of her pale, porcelain skin seemed impossibly soft, as though the slightest touch would leave an imprint. Lu noticed everything and smiled slyly, plotting silently in her mind. But their fragile peace shattered when Lu suddenly screamed, her bowl of porridge crashing to the floor. "There's a caterpillar in my food!" she shrieked, her face twisted in horror. The whole house plunged into chaos. Mrs. Ba stormed over, grabbed Lu by the hair, and yanked her aside. "What the hell are you doing, you wretched girl? Are you tired of living? There was a caterpillar in the porridge," Lu sobbed. Mrs. Ba immediately turned her furious gaze toward Mrs. Hai, her eyes blazing with rage. Everyone in the mansion knew Mrs. Hai had frightened Tu Yen with caterpillars earlier that day. But Mr. Ba, the family patriarch, continued eating calmly, as if nothing had happened. Bao, looking ashamed, said, "I'm sorry, Ma Ba. We don't even know who did it, but I'll apologize anyway. And even if it's true, it's just a bug. Sometimes you find them in vegetable soup too, right? Oh sure, it's only a small thing because the person eating the food isn't your precious son. But if it had been Bao, you would have turned this house upside down." Mrs. Ba sneered. "You dote on him like he's the center of the world. But my daughter is also your child. How can you treat her like this? If it bothers you so much, leave the table. No one's forcing you to stay," Mr. Ba said coldly. His indifference made Mrs. Ba seethe with rage, her face flushing red. Tu Yen discreetly nudged Bao under the table, signaling that she wanted to leave. Bao understood immediately. "She's still feeling unwell. I'll take her back to her room to rest," he said. Mr. Ba nodded but reminded the servants, "Once the dessert is ready, bring it to Mrs. Hai in Bao's room." He then turned to Mrs. Hai, softening his voice. "Are you full? Stay and have some dessert with me." But Mrs. Hai only shook her head and quickly followed Bao and Tu Yen out. Watching Mr. Ba treat Mrs. Hai and Bao with such tenderness, Mrs. Ba couldn't hold back her rage any longer. She jumped up and lunged at Mrs. Hai, ready to grab her hair. But Tu Yen immediately stepped in front of her to shield Mrs. Hai. Mrs. Ba grabbed Tu Yen's shirt and yanked hard, shouting, "Get out of the way! I'm going to beat her so she learns her lesson. Who knows what she'll put in my daughter's food next time?" The violent pull tore Tu Yen's shirt, exposing her bare shoulder. She gasped and tried to cover herself, but it was too late. Sun had already seen everything. His eyes gleamed with hunger, and he knew he wouldn't be able to sleep that night, haunted by the brief glimpse of her skin. Bao immediately stepped in, pulling Tu Yen into his arms to shield her. His face burned with fury. "What the hell are you doing? I already apologized," he shouted. At last, Mr. Ba lost his patience. He stood up, strode over to Mrs. Ba, and slapped her across the face so hard that she fell to the ground. She rolled around, wailing, "Why is my life so miserable? You keep that crazy woman in this house, letting her cause one disaster after another. She's almost gotten herself killed multiple times. Who knows when she'll snap and actually murder someone? She's a danger to my child, and I can't even demand justice for that." Bao ignored the screaming and crying behind him. He just held Tu Yen close and led her and Mrs. Hai out of the room without looking back. During that moment, Sun couldn't take his eyes off Tu Yen, while Mrs. Lu looked at him with eyes full of pain and disappointment. Lu watched the scene unfold and secretly laughed to herself. She had only dropped a single worm into the bowl of porridge, yet it had stirred up such a storm. Returning to her room, she carefully called Siu-Si in for a private conversation. As soon as the door closed, before Siu-Si could even speak, Lu quickly pressed a few silver coins into her hand. While handing over the money, Lu whispered a few words. The amount was equivalent to Siu-Si's entire month's wages, making her overjoyed and immediately pledge her loyalty to Lu, swearing repeatedly that she would be faithful. Siu-Si thought to herself that every maid in this house relied on their mistress to earn extra benefits, and only she, the newcomer, had no one to take notice of her. Now that Mrs. Tu had acknowledged her, Siu-Si resolved to devote herself entirely. In the next room, Sun was changing clothes, getting ready to go drinking, when he saw Mrs. Lu lying on the bed. Her gaunt, dark-skinned face made him feel disgusted. After getting dressed, he stepped out. Mrs. Lu called out to stop him. "It's late. Where are you going?" "Where? That's none of your business," he snapped. Sun had only walked a short distance when Siu-Si stealthily called out to him. "Master Sun, what now? Did Lu send you to follow me?" "No." Siu-Si quickly shook her head and handed him a folded piece of paper. "Miss Tu Yen told me to give this to you." Sun's face immediately brightened. After reading the letter, he was even more elated and tossed a few coins to Siu-Si as a reward, making her feel certain that she had chosen the right person to serve. Meanwhile, in her room, Mrs. Lu lay crying. Suddenly, Sun returned, silently lying down next to her. Mrs. Lu, overjoyed, wiped her tears and gently reached out to hug him, but he pushed her away. "Get away. Let me sleep." Rejected, Mrs. Lu curled up, hugging her pillow and turning her face to the wall, tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't want to be so skinny and dark. She had tried everything, eating nourishing foods, taking countless medications, yet her body remained frail. She knew that if she couldn't conceive by the end of the year, Sun would surely take a concubine. When that happened, she would become a shadow in this house, disregarded by everyone. Clutching the edge of her blanket tightly, her eyes burned with silent resentment. No matter what, she wouldn't let anyone trample her. In Tu Yen's room, Sun brought her a bowl of sweet glutinous rice dumplings. "I asked Siu-Si to add ginger to warm your stomach. You should eat a bit. You didn't eat much earlier." Tu Yen took the bowl, scooped a spoonful, but then set it back down. "Leave it there. I'll eat later. I don't feel well. I want to rest." "I have something to ask you," Sun said. Why did you say you came back here for my mother? But now you say something else. Who are you, really? What do you want from my family? Tu Yen sighed, knowing he would eventually ask. I didn't lie. I was deceived and sold to your father. I planned to escape, but they took all my belongings back to this house. I had no choice but to return to retrieve my mother's keepsake. I never expected that when I was about to formally greet the family, I'd see Lu sitting there, and she was the one originally meant to marry your father. She vaguely explained her past, but omitted her upbringing in the brothel and her ties to Madame Mailu. After hearing her story, Sun let out a relieved sigh. He believed her, reassured her to rest early, and returned to his room. Later that night, Sun sneaked to Tu Yen's room. His eyes darted around nervously as he carefully pushed the door open. On the table, only an empty bowl remained. The room echoed with Tu Yen's labored breathing, making Sun grin wickedly. Just as he was about to step inside, something cold and wet brushed against his back. Sun froze, turned sharply, and his eyes widened in horror. Before him was a severed head, with a mass of bloody, dripping intestines dangling beneath it. The stench of decay hit Sun's nose, making him gag. The head slowly floated closer, the shredded guts dripping yellow, sticky fluid onto the floor. The face was riddled with gashes, hair matted and tangled, with a cracked forehead threatening to split open. The head let out a hollow, echoing laugh that seemed to rise from the depths of hell. The dogs outside started howling, their eerie cries piercing the night. Meanwhile, in the next room, Sun's brother, Bao, was fast asleep when sudden knocking jolted him awake. Drowsily, he sat up and asked, "Who is it?" "Master Bao, Miss Tu Yen has a fever," came the response. Bao quickly jumped out of bed and rushed to her room. But when he opened his door, the hallway was completely empty. He hesitated for a moment but didn't overthink it, hurrying to Tu Yen's room. Inside, her flushed face glistened with sweat, her frail figure exuding a fragile allure. Her nightgown had come undone at the top, revealing a hint of skin that made Bao blush and immediately turn away. I'll call the physician," he stammered. But before he could leave, her delicate hand gently grasped his wrist. Her eyes, glistening with tears, gazed up at him. With a soft, weak voice, she whispered, "Don't go." Outside, the moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale glow through the window. The wind whistled, chilling Lu to the bone. She pulled her blanket tight, grumbling about the cold. Just as she was about to fall asleep, a strange sound echoed through the quiet night, a rhythmic thudding, like a massive toad hopping along the floor. She tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder and closer, as if heading straight for her room. Frustrated, she sat up, vowing to stomp on the creature if she found it. She swung open the door, only to freeze in terror. Before her stood a woman with tangled hair and vacant, white eyes. Her tongue lolled out, blackened and swollen, stretching grotesquely from her gaping mouth. The woman emitted guttural groans as she dragged herself forward with her hands, her lifeless lower body scraping across the floor. Each shove forward made her chest thud heavily against the wooden boards. Liu's legs gave out as she recognized the face. It was the village midwife. The corpse reached out, fingers clawing, but fell short. Her mouth gurgled broken, unintelligible sounds. Panic-stricken, Liu slammed the door shut, bolting it before collapsing to the floor, her entire body shaking with fear. In the corner of the floor lay a woman's head, hair disheveled and tangled. Her face was mangled as if hacked to pieces with a knife. A deep gash split her skull, and her eyes, white with tiny black pupils, spun in opposite directions. Her mouth opened and closed, letting out the gecko-like cry in an eerie, rhythmic pattern. The stench of decay burst from her mouth, overwhelming and rancid, seeping into Liu's lungs. Liu panicked, frantically crawling out from under the bed. But as she turned around, her body stiffened once more. The severed head floated in front of her, and dangling intestines swayed back and forth across the woman's face. The woman cackled, her laugh echoing eerily. Liu's mouth fell open, but she couldn't close it. The woman's laughter grew louder, and the dim glow of a beating heart within the bundle of intestines pulsed red. The glow slowly traveled up toward her throat, and without warning, the woman vomited a thick, black liquid straight into Liu's mouth. The foul, viscous fluid clung to Liu's skin, reeking of rot and blood. She gagged, struggling to breathe, and as she gasped for air, she accidentally swallowed some of the vile liquid. She flailed wildly, and suddenly, she found herself lying on the floor, bathed in the golden light of dawn streaming through the window. Liu gasped, realizing it had all been a nightmare. She tried to sit up, but her hand brushed against a silver ring lying beside her. Upon closer inspection, she recoiled. It was Tu Yen's ring, the one she had desperately demanded back. But the ring, which had been pitch black, was now gleaming white. Without warning, a searing pain shot through her bones, and she collapsed onto the floor, her voice barely a whisper as she cried out for help. At the same time, Siu's panic screams erupted from Tu Yen's room, alarming everyone in the house. Ba Hai rushed over, followed closely by the others. Even Ba Xie peered out to see what was happening. Only after a crowd had gathered did Sisi finally blurt out, "There's a man in Miss Tu Yen's room." Hearing this, Ba Xie hurried towards the room. But before she could enter, Bao lifted the curtain and stepped out. Ba Xie sneered, her face twisted with disdain. Breakfast that morning was unbearably tense. Tu Yen remained indifferent, as if nothing had happened. Liu, said to be ill, didn't come down to eat. Ba, perhaps still upset from the previous night, was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, Ba Kai broke the silence. "Ba Xie, check the calendar and pick a date for Bao's wedding." Ba Xie shot a sharp look at Tu Yen and scoffed. "They're already living together. Why bother with a wedding? What's your attitude?" Ba Kai snapped. "If my son loves someone, I'll marry him to her. What are you unhappy about? When the wedding is done, then you can voice your complaints." Ba Lu gently interjected, "Why don't we visit the lower region to consult a shaman? I know a very skilled one. We can stop by the temple too." Ba Hai's eyes lit up. "I want to go too." "No, it's too dangerous on the river," Ba Xie objected, frowning. "Stay home. We'll take a big boat, and there'll be plenty of people." "What danger?" Ba Hai argued. Seeing Ba Hai's persistence and Ba Xie's irritation, Ba Kai reluctantly gave in, thinking perhaps he was worrying too much. Once things settled, Ba Xie turned to Tu Yen, her voice syrupy but laced with sarcasm. "Tu Yen, finish your breakfast and get ready to leave. If we delay, and you end up pregnant, there won't be time for a proper wedding." "That would be such a shame." Ignoring the jab, Tu Yen calmly replied, "Yes, I understand." Bao, wanting to volunteer to join the trip, was cut off by Sun, who grumbled, "Bao, you're coming with me to harvest the rice today. You haven't helped out in days." Bao glanced at Tu Yen, searching her face for a reaction. Seeing her give a slight nod, he reluctantly agreed. "Okay, I'll go with you today." The midday sun bathed the river in a golden shimmer, reflecting off the water's surface. Near a clump of wild banana trees by an ancient riverside shrine, Black Impermanence crouched in the shadows, his dark traditional garb blending into the foliage. The silver chain coiled around his arm glinted faintly as he squinted towards the shrine. Inside, Tuette sat rubbing her neck, the spot where a ghost child had bitten her. Black Impermanence narrowed his eyes, straining to see whether the wound had healed, but the distance made it hard to tell. Suddenly, a voice sounded behind him. "Who are you planning to capture?" Startled, he immediately drew his weapon, ready to strike, until a familiar voice yelped, "It's me, Dao." Black Impermanence quickly clamped a hand over Dao's mouth and dragged him into the shadows. Once released, Dao couldn't contain his curiosity. "You're here to catch someone, aren't you? Is the princess's wound healed?" Dao slapped his thigh, exclaiming, "Oh, it's healed quite a bit, but I heard it still hurts. She keeps holding her neck." Black Impermanence's voice turned cold. "I told her 1,000 times not to interfere with human karma. When a deity uses their true form to intervene, they can be harmed. Worse, meddling too deeply can create entangled karma, binding them to the cycle of reincarnation to repay endless debts. He sighed, voice heavy with regret. People often wonder why gods don't help. It's not because they don't want to, it's because they can't. Even the smallest action can completely alter a person's fate. Karma is a balance that must never be disturbed. If everyone only receives happiness, then who will bear the suffering? Dao stood frozen, not expecting that his casual question would be met with such seriousness by Hak Vo Thuong. He placed a small vial in Dao's hand and whispered, "Give this to the prince, but don't say it was from me." Just as he was about to leave, a commotion echoed from the riverside. A large boat docked, and from it stepped elegantly dressed people of noble bearing. Dao, delighted, thought to himself, "They're so rich. Maybe I can at least get a boiled chicken out of this." Seizing the last bit of daylight, he rushed back to the shrine, but Hak Vo Thuong held him back. His eyes were locked on a young woman in a green ao dai who had just stepped off the boat, Tu Yen. But what truly caught his attention was the strange aura of dark energy lingering around her, distinctly different from an ordinary person. The matriarch led Mo Lu, Tu Yen, and the third wife to the shrine to offer sacrifices. The spirit of the deceased master stood beside the spirit of his daughter, Thuong, watching the matriarch meticulously order servants to bring water for the second wife. Seeing her kindness towards her husband's concubine, Thuong couldn't help but sigh. She must be a truly virtuous person. Before Thuong could say more, the second wife suddenly panicked and cried out, "Where is Tom? Where is Tom?" Realizing she was searching for her precious cloth doll, Emolu reassured her. "Perhaps you left it on the boat." Tu Yen quickly volunteered, "I'll go back and look for it." Worried, the second wife followed, and Emolu, catching a subtle glance from the matriarch, immediately went after them. On the boat, the second wife and Tu Yen meticulously searched every corner. Then, Emolu's voice suddenly echoed from behind, "Are you looking for this?" Both turned to see the cloth doll in Emolu's hand. The second wife's eyes sparkled with relief, and she rushed forward, but Tu Yen quickly held her back. Emolu was standing by the edge of the river, holding the doll over the water. One wrong move and the second wife would plunge into the river. Tu Yen calmly asked, "Why are you doing this? Helping evil people, do you think they will spare you? Or are you just a pawn to be discarded once you've outlived your usefulness? Think for yourself, not for them." But Emolu's resolve remained unshaken. Without hesitation, she threw the doll into the river. The second wife, frantic, leapt in after it, and Tu Yen, unable to let her drown, followed. Above, the matriarch watched coldly and ordered the boat to depart, ignoring the two struggling figures in the water. As the boat sailed away, Zhang Tuet commanded Thuong to possess the second wife and help pull them both ashore. But Hak Vo Thuong stepped in to stop her, saying, "No, that would defy fate." They were on the verge of a fierce argument when, miraculously, the second wife surfaced, dragging Tu Yen with her. Silently, she helped the girl to shore, unseen by anyone on the departing boat. As she wiped the water from her face, the second wife recalled the night the young master had confided in her. He had admitted he knew Tu Yen's past was complicated, but his love for her was sincere. He had never asked for anything in his life, but this time he pleaded for her acceptance of Tu Yen. The second wife tried to revive Tu Yen, but when her efforts failed, Zhang Tuet signaled to Thuong, who quickly transferred some energy to help. Tu Yen coughed up water and gradually regained consciousness. Seeing her safe, the second wife scolded, "You can't even swim. Next time, save yourself before saving others." Tu Yen, her voice hoarse, replied, "Do you think they would have let me go? If I hadn't jumped, they would have thrown me in anyway." Tu Yen, aware of the second wife's secret, chose to stay silent, waiting for her to speak first. Meanwhile, the matriarch's boat returned home, where the patriarch, Ba, awaited with a face full of worry. One of the servants, left behind, timidly recounted the events. "The lady told me to fetch something, but by the time I got back, the boat had already left. Hearing this, Ba's heart sank. He immediately sent people to search the river, but after hours, there was no news. Anxious, he stormed into the house, demanding, "Where is the second wife?" The matriarch replied, emotionless. She dropped the doll into the river and jumped in after it. Tu Yen followed to save her. They both drowned. Ba's ears buzzed, and his face flushed with rage. Pointing a trembling finger at the matriarch, he tried to speak, but dizziness overtook him, and he collapsed to the floor. Meanwhile, the second wife and Tu Yen waited by the shore until Ba's men arrived to rescue them. On the boat back, the little servant boy, Tai, admired Ba. He was right. Everything he suspected was true. Zhang Tuet glanced at Dao and the old master, silently signaling them to follow Tu Yen. Something still felt off. By the time they reached the Ba family estate, night had fallen, but the grand mansion glowed brightly with lanterns. The servants huddled together, whispering anxiously. Seeing the second wife and Tu Yen return, they almost cried out in relief, but Tu Yen quickly silenced them. Inside, furious shouting echoed through the house. Ba, chest heaving with rage, yelled, You're a wicked woman." The little servant, Teo, tried to steady him, rubbing his chest to calm him. The matriarch, however, stood her ground, shoving Emolu aside and screaming back, "You're yelling at me for a crazy woman? Don't forget, without me, your family would have been ruined. If I hadn't asked my parents to help, you'd be a beggar by now." Ba, eyes filled with sorrow, whispered, "I stayed with you out of gratitude, but I've let you destroy everyone in this house. I married you because of duty, but I've endured enough. Don't think I don't know who killed Tom or why the third wife kept losing her babies. I only wanted you to leave the ones I love alone, but even that was too much to ask. Why are you so heartless?" The matriarch laughed bitterly through her tears, her voice sharp and broken. "The ones you love? If you loved her so much, why did you bring the third wife and Tu Yen into this house? You don't love anyone, Ba. You only love yourself." The story ends with a house torn apart, its foundations crumbling under the weight of hidden sins and unspeakable grief. "Because I saw you like to fight and compete, I brought home another wife so that she could play with you, hoping you would let Lua go. Didn't you notice? Every time you harmed Lua, I brought home another wife. Decades have passed, Lua has gone mad, and I am old, yet you are still relentless. I just want to live peacefully with Lua. Why are you so cruel to me?" The old man spoke, pounding his chest, tears streaming down as if his endurance had finally run dry. At that moment, Sun and Bao returned from harvesting rice and saw the servants crowding in front of the house. Sun shouted, "What are you all doing standing here instead of working?" Bao, who was more cheerful, saw Bahai and Tu Yen, and he ran over to ask, "Why are you standing here? You nearly scared me to death." Upon hearing this, Basay rushed out, her head pounding with pain from arguing with her husband. Seeing Bahai and Tu Yen still alive and well, her anger surged, and she collapsed unconscious. When Ong Ba saw Bahai return, he was overjoyed. He stepped forward, wanting to touch her to confirm he wasn't dreaming. But before he could take 2 more steps, he too collapsed and fainted. The mansion erupted in chaos, with people scrambling to fetch medicine and call for the doctor. While everyone focused on tending to Ong Ba and Ba Xie, in a dark room within the mansion, a severed head with trailing entrails bowed low over a child's body, gnawing ravenously. The child lay lifeless, eyes wide open, mouth agape, with a deep bite on the neck exposing bone. Blood oozed from the wound, soaking the bed and dripping onto the floor, pooling into a dark red stain. The child had died without even managing to scream. The head continued to eat greedily, then let out a guttural, satisfied laugh, as if appeasing an ancient, unending hunger. When Vong, Ong Tong, and Dao stepped into the mansion, they immediately sensed something was wrong. The place was eerily silent, devoid of even ghostly shadows, as if all spirits had fled in fear of something. With no one to question, the two cautiously explored the mansion. Suddenly, A chilling laugh echoed from the dark room in the distance. They exchanged wary glances and hurried toward the sound. Upon witnessing the grisly scene inside, Dao urged Ong Tong to report back to Zhang Tuet, deciding to stay behind to investigate what exactly was happening. The next morning, the mansion was once again in turmoil, awakened by Baba's blood-curdling screams. Her cries triggered more terrified shrieks throughout the household. Despite his frailty, Ong Ba struggled to his feet and went to investigate, finding Bahai already standing nearby. Seeing the scene inside, Ong Ba's eyes widened in horror. Speechless, he quickly covered Bahai's eyes to shield her from the gruesome sight. Inside, Baba sat on the floor, wailing, clutching her daughter's disemboweled remains, desperately trying to stuff the torn intestines back into the cold, lifeless body. Shaking with fear and rage, Ong Ba ordered someone to inform the authorities. Not long after, a French official arrived with over 10 soldiers. They interrogated the household and searched the mansion all morning, but found no clues. Eventually, after pocketing a few gold bars from Ong Ba, the official puffed out his chest and promised, "Rest assured, Mr. Ba, I will find the culprit and seek justice for your daughter. I will report this to my superiors and begin an investigation immediately. Trust me." Then he left, never looking back. The young girl's body was hastily buried that very night without a funeral. From that day on, Baba went insane. She sat alone all day, talking and laughing to herself, sometimes locking herself in her daughter's room, whispering as if the child were still alive. Meanwhile, Tu Yen finally had a chance to meet Lu in private. Recently, Lu rarely left her room. The moment she pulled Lu aside, Tu Yen bluntly demanded, "Where's the ring? Give it back." Lu swatted Tu Yen's hand away, her eyes cold. "I changed my mind. I won't give it back. If I do, you'll expose my true identity. I can't do anything to you now, but at least with this ring, I can control you. So I'll keep it and you stay quiet." Enraged, Tu Yen lunged to snatch the ring, but Lu raised her hand with a sly smile. "Try taking it. I might just toss it away so you can never find it again." In the middle of their scuffle, Tu Yen spotted a shadow flickering in the garden. Reluctantly, she stepped back and let Lu leave. But as Lu passed by, Tu Yen froze. Sweat had washed away part of Lu's makeup, revealing 3 black scars on her neck, identical to the marks on her mother's corpse years ago. Returning to her room, Tu Yen sat in shock for a long time, slowly piecing together the horrifying truth behind the girl's death. When Bao entered and saw her dazed state, he touched her forehead to check for a fever, startling her. Blushing, Bao teased, "We're getting married soon. Why are you still so shy?" "Marry you?" she snapped, pulling her hand away. He scooted his chair closer, his face red. "Don't you think you should take responsibility for me?" From the shadows of the room, Dao sighed, shaking his head. "She might as well leave me. Maybe I should just quit and go live in a shrine." Luckily for Dao, Tu Yen grew serious again. "I think I know who killed little An," she said. Bao sobered up instantly, waiting for her to continue. She stared at him for a long while, wanting to seize this moment to reveal her entire past. But she couldn't summon the courage. She only shared part of her childhood, the part where she saw her mother turn into a forest spirit. Meanwhile, in Base's room, Sun hummed cheerfully as he entered. After a fierce argument with Ong Ba, Basie had fallen ill and remained bedridden for days. Seeing her son so joyful, she struggled to sit up and scolded him gently. "Your sister just died, and you're this cheerful? Your father will scold you if he sees this." Ignoring her words, Sun clung to her leg and pleaded, "Mother, let me marry another wife. I've fallen for a girl, and she likes me too. Please arrange the wedding." Before Basie could respond, Emolu entered, carrying a tray of porridge. Her hands trembled, her heart aching. She turned to Basie, her voice quivering. "Didn't you promise me that if I got rid of Bahai, you wouldn't let him marry again?" Startled, Sun slapped her, silencing her immediately. Suddenly, the tray of porridge fell to the ground, spilling everywhere. The mistress collapsed onto the floor, clutching her cheek, her eyes filled with resentment as she glared at the young master. The matriarch's face briefly showed discomfort at her daughter-in-law's attitude. Her voice turned cold. "Have you managed to get rid of the second wife yet? Or do you just stand here lecturing me? Who asked you to be barren? It's a miracle that Sun hasn't abandoned you yet. Stop crying. I've already decided. After marrying Tu Yen to Bao, I'll bring a concubine home for Sun." Watching Li's desolate figure stumble away like a lost soul, the matriarch felt a fleeting pang of sadness. Li's current fate mirrored her own from years ago, loving someone who would never love her back. The matriarch sighed and gently reminded Sun, "Don't go out tonight. Stay home and comfort her a bit. We'll need her family's help in the future." Lu wandered aimlessly until late afternoon before quietly returning home. She didn't say a word, heading straight to the kitchen and insisting on preparing porridge for the matriarch herself, as she always did. The maid, unsuspecting, handed over the task and left. Lu meticulously chopped the meat, and when the kitchen staff were distracted, she quickly pulled a small banana leaf packet from her pocket. Inside were pieces of bright red toad liver. Her eyes burned with hatred, and without a shred of hesitation, she minced the poisonous liver into the meat. That evening, the maid served the porridge to the matriarch, proudly mentioning that Mistress Lu had personally cooked it. The matriarch nodded approvingly, satisfied that, despite her flaws, Lu was obedient. After finishing her meal, she instructed the maid, "Tell the others to keep their distance from my room tonight. I can't sleep with all that noise." Little did she know that this very request would lead to her dying alone, unnoticed. Meanwhile, Lu lay motionless on her bed, clutching her hands tightly, her eyes bloodshot. She listened to the door creak open as Sun entered. He didn't want to return home, but the matriarch threatened to cancel his wedding to Hoa, so he begrudgingly came back. Seeing Lu turn toward the wall, he assumed she was crying and grew even more irritated. "Already ugly, and now crying? Crying just makes you uglier," he muttered. He eventually fell asleep, snoring softly. In the dim light, Lu quietly sat up, sliding a sharp knife from beneath her pillow. The blade gleamed coldly as she swiftly slashed across Sun's throat. He jolted awake, eyes wide with horror, trying to scream, but blood gushed from his mouth, silencing him. Lu climbed on top of him, stabbing him repeatedly. The sickening sound of the blade piercing flesh echoed through the room, each stab releasing a torrent of her bottled-up hatred. Blood splattered everywhere, soaking the sheets. Her sobs choked out between gasps. "If I can't have you, no one else will." Outside, the servants heard noises but only shook their heads, assuming Sun was beating Lu again. They didn't want to intervene, fearing it would only humiliate her further. No one imagined the blood-soaked tragedy unfolding behind that closed door. Elsewhere, Bao and Tu Yen were oblivious to the carnage, hiding in a dense hibiscus bush, eyes fixed on Liu's window. Bao trembled uncontrollably. "Are you scared? Go home. I can spy alone and tell you tomorrow," Tu Yen whispered. Bao shook his head, voice shaky yet defiant. "No, I'm not scared. Ghosts aren't scary." But the words had barely left his mouth when their eyes widened in horror. Liu's severed head floated out of the window, dragging her intestines behind it. Her heart dangled from the tangled guts, pulsating with a dim, eerie glow. Bao fainted on the spot, collapsing onto the dirt. Dao, sitting next to him, sneered and muttered, "Not scared, huh? Just fainting for fun, I guess." Ignoring Bao, Tu Yen bolted to Liu's room, where the headless corpse lay limp on the bed. Tu Yen's hands shook as she grasped Liu's icy hand, struggling to slide a silver ring off her finger. The lifeless body felt like an empty shell, stirring old memories of her mother's death. Realizing something was wrong, Tu Yen dashed to the second wife's room, only to freeze in terror. Lu stood there, grinning wickedly, her mouth stretching unnaturally wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. The second wife lay unconscious, oblivious to the looming horror. Liu's laughter echoed through the house, making the dogs in the backyard howl mournfully. Meanwhile, Dao frantically tried to wake Bao, When Bao finally stirred, he mistook Dao for a servant, grabbed a broom, and sprinted toward the second wife's room. Tu Yen, paralyzed with fear, nearly collapsed. Just as Lu lunged at her, Bao burst in, wildly swinging the broom at Liu's floating head. The clamor startled the entire household. Mr. Ba rushed in, intending to rescue the second wife, but froze at the ghastly sight. Liu's disembodied head, intestines trailing behind her, heart flickering like a ghostly lantern. No one dared approach. They just stood there, trembling. Lu attempted to flee, but a sharp crack split the air as something pierced her glowing heart. She shrieked in agony, her body convulsing. The foul stench of burning flesh filled the room, making everyone gag. Liu's heart, fractured and bleeding, pulsed weakly one last time before dimming into darkness. In the middle of the crowd, Dao stood tall, blending in, but his eyes gleamed with determination. He called out, and Zhang Tuet appeared, dressed in a brown bebe shirt, holding a rattan whip. Her presence was striking, her whip glowing with an eerie light. Liu's eyes widened in terror as she sensed the energy radiating from Zhang Tuet. The burning light made her skin crawl, and feeling the danger, she turned to flee, but Dao quickly blocked her path. Trapped, Lu dropped to her knees, begging for mercy. Please spare me. I was a victim too, she cried. Zhang Tuet's lips curled into a cold smile. If you want to live, tell me the truth. Otherwise, don't blame me for what happens next. Liu's body trembled as her eyes turned wild. A guttural growl escaped her throat, animalistic and haunting. Suddenly, her face twisted unnaturally, and a shrill, foreign voice echoed from within her. It was not her own. Victim? You think I wasn't a victim? The village shaman took me, tortured me, turned me into this thing. I didn't choose this. Why didn't anyone save me back then? Why did they let me suffer? I just wanted to live. Is that so wrong? You humans pushed me to the edge, and now you punish me for surviving? The mother of Tu Yen broke my seal by accident, and I possessed her daughter's body. But she resisted. She wouldn't eat human flesh. She tried to stop me, but fate brought me Lu, a soul as dark as night. Her evil heart made her the perfect vessel. Do you know how happy I was? Zhang Tuet's grip tightened around her whip. The spirit's tragic past weighed heavy on her heart, but she couldn't ignore the countless lives it had destroyed. Without hesitation, she lashed the whip, striking directly at the spirit's heart. A crimson spark shot out from Liu's chest, trying to return to Tu Yen's ring. Seeing this, Bao swiftly grabbed Tu Yen's hand and yanked the ring off her finger, hurling it to the ground. The red spark fused back into the ring, its surface crackling with sinister black lines. Zhang Tuet carefully picked up the ring, wrapped it in a black talisman, and handed it to Dao. Understanding the weight of the responsibility, he nodded, smiling faintly before leaving with Zhang Tuet. The household staff, still shaken, whispered among themselves as they watched the two mysterious strangers disappear into the morning mist. Some speculated that they were exorcists hired by Mr. Ba, but even Mr. Ba and Bao exchanged bewildered looks. Neither of them had called for help.
Meanwhile, Liu slowly regained consciousness.
Her eyes darted around, filled with horror as she saw everyone staring at her with disgust and fear. She tried to move but couldn't. Looking down, she screamed in agony. Her lower body was gone. In its place, a tangled mess of intestines sprawled across the floor, oozing black blood that attracted swarms of flies. The room buzzed with the sound of wings, the air thick with the stench of decay. As dawn broke and the roosters crowed, blood began to pour from Liu's eyes, nose, and mouth. Her skin shriveled like a dried fruit, withering away as her body decayed. Lu, who had once prized her beauty above all else, died in the most grotesque and painful way imaginable, her lifeless eyes wide open, unable to find peace. But the horror didn't end there. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the mansion. A servant ran in, face pale as a ghost. "Master, Madame Ba is dead in her room, and Bao's brother's son, and Madame Lu stabbed him to death before hanging herself." The news hit Mr. Ba like a thunderbolt. His legs gave out and he collapsed, clutching his chest. The tragedy unfolded like a nightmare, leaving the family shattered and broken. The authorities ruled the events as a case of personal vendetta, blaming Madame Lee's grief and resentment. But the villagers whispered darker theories, that the Ba family had brought a curse upon themselves through years of cruelty and sin. Mr. Ba didn't care about the rumors. He had lost too much to worry about what people said. Meanwhile, Madame Hai finally dropped her act of insanity. She had long suspected the truth after overhearing an argument between Mr. Ba and Madame Ba. She had pretended to be mad to avoid confrontation. But now, knowing the twisted reason behind Mr. Ba's actions, she felt a bitter mix of sorrow and forgiveness. In her room, Tu Yen quietly packed her belongings. The night before, she had dreamed of her mother, who told her she was finally free to reincarnate. It was a sign that Tu Yen needed to move on. As she sat, lost in thought, Bao entered the room. Seeing her solemn expression, he sat beside her and gently hugged her from behind. "You're leaving again?" he asked, voice soft and trembling. Tu Yen stayed silent for a long while before deciding to tell him everything. Her past, her sins, her fears. She braced herself for rejection, knowing that once Bao heard the truth, he would surely let her go. When she finished, Bao didn't say a word. Tu Yen smiled bitterly, trying to pull away, but Bao held her tighter. "Give me a second," he whispered. "I'm just trying to think of a name for our future child."
Tu Yen Froze.
She turned to slap his arm, scolding him through her tears, but he just grinned. "I love you for who you are now," Bao said. "The past doesn't matter. It didn't have me in it, so I don't care. What I do care about is building a happy future with you." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Tu Yen cried, not out of sadness, but out of hope. Tu Yen smiled brightly at him. She recalled that night, the moment she brought the sweet soup to her lips. She had already caught a familiar scent. Growing up in a place full of love affairs and secrets, how could she not recognize what that smell was? So, she poured the entire bowl away. She had only been acting to see who was behind the scheme. Seeing her lost in thought, he suddenly tickled her. A burst of clear, carefree laughter escaped her lips, blending with the rustling leaves in the evening breeze. At that moment, it was as if a lone bird soaring in the vast sky had finally found a peaceful place to land. And that, dear listeners, is the end of The Cursed Forest, A Soul's Revenge. Wishing you all a good night. See you next time for another thrilling story.